have a very special guest here who is an expert on the space of cannabis. She's an attorney here in Sacramento, California, and her name is Ariana Van Alstyne. Thank you, Ariana, for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So share a little bit with us. First of all, there are three things you and I discussed earlier that in the space of cannabis here in California that's really interesting. It's happening. There are discussions around it. First and foremost, that we discussed earlier, free medical cannabis.
Did you bring any, by the way?
I did not. Sorry.
And on that note, free medical cannabis for medical patients. So there's a bill that the governor actually vetoed. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what's going on?
So there's a bill that went before the legislature that was passed on both sides, but ultimately vetoed by the governor for not being in the spirit of Proposition 64. There's a big concern among cannabis patients and medical patient advocates that with the passage of Prop 64 legalizing adult use cannabis, that the patient side has gone by the wayside somewhat.
So are we looking at that as possibly a bill that could potentially get passed, maybe even in next year?
Hopefully that bill will be renewed in some form. Patient advocates are certainly concerned about that in California.
And what did the bill exactly do?
So the bill would allow medical cannabis retailers to provide medical cannabis to patients free of cost.
Right.
And prior to implementation of regulations in compliance with Prop 64, there was an ability of retailers to provide free medical cannabis for patients, and there's a concern that particularly with the patients who are using cannabis for long-term care, such as for cancer and
medicinal use.
Yes, other
so why did the governor veto it? Do we have an idea of what his stance on it was?
So there's conjecture that perhaps there have been too many cannabis bills in the legislature, which is. There is a working out of post-Prop 64 world, and we're in the process of drafting regulations for California. It's the second final draft of regulations right now, so there are still a number of details to be worked out.
And plus the market, the illegal market is blowing up now, right? So much easier to get on the illegal market.
Well, on that same note, we were going to talk about the second interesting topic here, which is, a lot of these dispensaries and so forth, they can't get a bank account, right? They're dealing with cash. There have been articles, there have been stories, and
we had a bill.
So forth. But tell us about that. So is that something that we can again expect as being a renewed potential bill here in California?
Yes. So SB 930, which was on the legislature's panel for last year, is likely to be renewed in some form this year. Ultimately, the issue is that there is a conflict between federal and state laws, and it will be difficult to find a state solution without having a federal solution.
Right.
However, SB 930 was kind of an internal circular model that would at least allow a state chartered or a state formed bank to be able to bank those industry members in California.
But aren't there some
$100 million buried?
No, literally. But
Yes.
there are credit unions who are now actually looking at it closely too, aren't there?
Absolutely. So credit unions in the United States were traditionally created to bank the unbanked and have a different set of rules than an FDIC insured bank.
Right.
And so there are ways that our government has come up with.
Right.
Where we've said, as a financial institution, you can bank a cannabis business in line with these particular set of guidelines, which is much more onerous than a traditional bank account. But for credit unions, some credit unions are banking the cannabis.
They're scared the federal government's going to come in and seize their accounts.
Right.
So, but here's the thing, we keep talking about regulating and these issues and these obstacles, but then that opens up the flood doors for illegal activity, right? So
Absolutely.
Cheaper.
It's just,
Absolutely.
again, California. Let's see what happens here so that maybe we have an impact in that space for the rest of the country too. It's about time. The other final piece that's really interesting, we were talking about licensing agencies. So there's a temporary license that somebody actually can get as a dispensary, for example, or an operating facility when it comes to cannabis. Now, that actually might come to an end in December. Is that what we're hearing?
That will come to an end in December. Throughout this last year, businesses have been able to obtain a temporary license throughout the supply chain.
Right.
Each of the licensing agencies, there are 3 of them, will terminate that program on December 31st.
What is that going to mean to these operations?
That means that businesses that were hoping to be able to operate in the next 3 to 6 months may not be able to operate until their annual license is issued, which at this point, I know of annual licenses that were submitted at the beginning of this year, and those licenses still have yet to be granted.
So it could go on forever, and in the meantime, these guys are going to have to wait until they can actually fully operate.
It's shocking. Bureaucracy screwing this up.
I mean, that's my...
Who saw this coming?
Well, to be fair, in terms of size,
That's later.
the entire state of Colorado is like a third of the size of Los Angeles.
Right.
So if you think about the scale that our legislature and our regulators are dealing with, it's a completely different market than Colorado or Washington or Oregon or the other legal markets.
And every city looks at it as a cash cow, and they're just
Figuring it out.
rolling to get their money
there
out.
are other opportunities there, like you said, we're missing out on, and again, government getting involved. So more to be said. Thank you for your time. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Very interesting space, and obviously California being the pioneer in the space as well. We're going to keep a close eye on it. That being said, we're going into break again, thanking our sponsors. By the way, have you guys noticed these beautiful SacTown5 mugs? I just want to acknowledge these were.
You mean this mug?
Yes, we all got a fancy one. I want to acknowledge Felix, who's here, I believe, still in our crowd. And he's with a direct marketing company. Thank you guys so much, Felix. We love our mugs. Give a round of applause for that one.
We're not saying what's in them.
Yes.
No one.
So now we're going to wrap up and go into a quick break. Stay tuned because the next one's going to be a fun one. We got entertainment once again. This one, we're going to be covering, again, Dead or Alive, Tweet of the Week, even a DMV story with this guy, and wrapping up and even acknowledging a very special sponsor. So stay tuned. We'll be back. SacTown5.